Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. In today's talk I was going to cover symbolism of Jupiter, also known as Guru or Brihaspati, from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective. So let's go ahead. A note beforehand though, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. Also here, I have all my teaching videos on Jyotish Vedic Astrology in my concepts playlist. So if you're looking to learn Jyotish, I would look there. Also, this talk is on Jupiter, and so I also have a playlist on the planets or Grahas, as they're known in Sanskrit. And so all the information, teaching videos related to the planets is there. And throughout my talks, whenever you see a double asterisk, that means that there's a teaching video available. So if I start talking about planetary war and you're like, what's that? You'll see a double asterisk next to that, and then you can go check out that video if you really want to find out what that's all about. Alrighty. So Jupiter, also known as Guru or Brihaspati, Jupiter day is Thursday, and Jupiter is strong in the following positions. So when it in its own sign, and so Jupiter owns or rules Sagittarius or Danu in Sanskrit, and Pisces or Mina. So so whenever Jupiter is in Sagittarius or Pisces, it's strong. It's exalted or an Ucha position in Cancer or Karka. Swa, so when it's in its own sign, meaning when it's in Sag or Pisces. Also when it's retrograde or Vakri, planets are considered to be stronger when they're retrograde in Vedic astrology. And also when it has directional strength or Digbala. So Jupiter is more powerful when it's in the first house or Bhava, which corresponds with the eastern direction or about 6 a.m. in the morning. So weakness positions for Jupiter, it's debilitated or Nicha when it's in Capricorn or Makara. It's weak when it's Combust, so very close to the sun, also known as Asta in Sanskrit. It's weak when it's a planetary war loser, or Graha Yuddha is a planetary war. And it's also weak when it's in Sandhi, in the first or last degree of any sign, which is actually true for all planets. So the relationships that Jupiter has with other planets is that it's friendly with Sun, Moon, and Mars. It's neutral with Saturn, and it's an enemy. The enemies of Jupiter are Mercury and Venus. What's interesting about Jupiter, though, it's the only planet or Graha, that's not an enemy to any other planet. So whenever any planet is in Sagittarius or Pisces, because Jupiter rules those rashis, constellations, they're neutral at worst and friendly at best. So, but again, that also gets at the general nature and benefic nature of Jupiter. So qualities of Jupiter. So when you start thinking about Jupiter Guru, what sorts of qualities does it bring to any event or person? So it rules knowledge, fortune, and also spiritual knowledge. I guess I should have put education first. I might change. Hopefully I remember to change education, fortune, spiritual knowledge. More than worldly knowledge. Worldly knowledge, if you watch my video on the symbolism Mercury's more worldly knowledge. And again, the qualities of Jupiter is it's mild, benign, soft-hearted. Yeah, so it's a very gentle, sweet planet, and it brings those qualities to everything it touches, generally. Again, there can be exceptions, like if Jupiter happens to be a Chidra Graha or a planet of vulnerability, that may not always be true. Although it will still bring some goodness, even if for some reason Jupiter is like maybe a temporal malefic or a Chidra Graha. Jupiter will still bring some goodness to it. It'll still bring some of that into it, but the outcome may still not be what people would prefer. Jupiter represents ether, so if we're talking about medical things like from an Ayurveda or traditional Indian medicine perspective, it represents the element of ether or space, and it also represents kapha or the earth element if you're talking about the three types, vata, pitta, kapha. It represents kapha, or wind, fire, earth, so different constitutions, prakrutis, and symptomology, so prakruti. It's considered a sattvic planet, so meaning it's spiritual and high-minded. It also has more of a masculine energy to it, so potentially Jupiter, if we're evaluating children in somebody's horoscope, and Jupiter is involved, that can potentially, again, depending on what's with it and where it is, it can indicate a masculine energy. And again, as I mentioned previously, it is considered a natural benefic. That's just the natural way of it. It's a benefic planet. So if Jupiter were a person, what kind of person? So if somebody had some very strong placements of Jupiter, especially if it's aspecting the first house or the ascendant, the lagna, the rising sign, these are all different names for the same thing. Like what sorts of qualities would that person potentially possess? Well, one, Jupiter is considered to be an advisor, but specifically a spiritual advisor. Venus is also considered an advisor, but Venus is more of a worldly advisor, so more of a practical advisor. Jupiter also represents children, teachers, peers, proper high-minded people, priests, gurus, rabbis, any person involved, who has a profession related to religion or spirituality. Somebody who's wise, fair, courteous, also intuitive, happy, optimistic, erudite. So again, there it gets brings in that quality of education. Also philosophical. They happen to be part of the people who have strong Jupiter aspecting the lagna or first house. They may be part of what's considered the Brahmana caste. And again, classically, when you're talking about caste from an Indian culture, not an Indian culture, but Indian kind of classical text perspective, it's really just talking about the state or quality of the mind. It doesn't have to do with one class of people being better or worse than another. That's something that unfortunately was adopted through generations culturally or historically, but not in the classical text. That's not what the caste system is about. So for somebody who's a Brahman, there's somebody who tends to study and learn by memorize like sacred texts, and they might end up becoming a priest and going down that road. So from that perspective, so somebody who might be religious, spiritual, high-minded, honorable, somebody who persuades through good counsel, rational thinking, that sort of thing. Jupiter can also represent somebody who's tall in height. It can represent things like average or ordinary clothes, nothing really showy, or something that's kind of stands out. And also, if we're talking about the partnerships, relationships, that sort of thing, Jupiter represents somebody who's a suitable, well-matched partner. So psychology, you probably are already getting the drift here. Jupiter represents things like growth, expansion, humanitarian-minded person, spiritual, wise, optimism, faithful. Somebody who's genial, generous, jovial. I always kind of think of Santa Claus when I think of Jupiter. For some reason, somebody's sort of jolly. Humor, although, again, if you watched my video on the symbolism Mercury can also be pretty funny, and the comedian as well. Although I think Jupiter's more of just a jolly, good-natured, happy person more than jokester. Jokester, I guess I think of Mercury more. But could be. I guess if they're in a good enough mood, that would happen. Somebody who's idealistic and somebody who has good judgment. Now the thing is, if Jupiter's not well placed, or if it's in negative condition, weak condition, then you might start getting more of the negative aspects of Jupiter, even though Jupiter is considered the great benefic. So somebody might become overconfident or overindulgent because, again, that expansion or growth, like maybe they're optimistic, but they don't have great judgment. And so they're going to overdo things, and then end up in trouble that way. Somebody who's extravagant. So maybe they're generous, but maybe they end up giving away all their money and they can't pay their bills, that sort of thing. It could be somebody who's immoral because, again, if Jupiter is about faith and justice and that sort of thing, and balance, then somebody who has a weakly conditioned Jupiter or badly placed Jupiter, it might be somebody who's immoral because they're not very wise and generous and well-natured. They can also be somebody who's greedy or materialistic, especially for somebody who wants the best. Again, there's this sort of exaggerated quality to Jupiter, because, again, Jupiter is the largest planet that we can see with our eyes, and so that sort of largeness, that kind of spirit, as well as the body, which we'll talk about, are things that are indicated by Jupiter. So professions. So if Jupiter is related to a career for somebody, then their career might involve things like giving advice, especially spiritual or religious advice, children, religion, spirituality generally, preaching, teaching, writing, literature. So here you get into the education part of Jupiter, publishing, philosophy, orators, people who speak or sing, especially depending on singing and poetry, that sort of thing can be related to Jupiter. Prophecy, so again, that's getting more into the some sort of profession that requires intuition, like maybe a tarot card reader or something like that. Somebody who requires higher knowledge or education, so some sort of job that requires a PhD, for example. Recitation or study of the scriptures, so maybe a rabbi. Also things like nature, sky, and biology. These things are represented by Jupiter because, again, the sky, for example, is expansive, and biology because Jupiter represents living things, especially humans. So if we're talking animal, vegetable, or mineral, Jupiter represents animals and especially humans. Also, there's an aspect of Jupiter where it could be involving import and export, foreigners, traveling. So there's this kind of, again, expansive, going out on the road, adventure, that sort of thing, pilgrimage. And then, again, getting back to this idea of justice and balance and equilibrium, there's law, judging, legislating, planning. And then also there's the money piece. So things like banks, money lending, capitalist, finance, stock market, people are involved in these places and things. And also charity. So that gets into more of the charitable, honorable, generous nature of Jupiter. Government can be ambassadors, especially because there's, it's involving foreign relations and diplomacy. Somebody who's going to be well-mannered and graceful, poised, as opposed to a troublemaker. And also, it seems rather random, but race stables as well. And I don't know for sure why that's on the list, but it might be because Jupiter rules Sagittarius, and Sagittarius, the symbol of Sagittarius is what do they call it? Centaur, so half man, half horse. So Sagittarius is related, has some relationship with horses. So I don't know if it's just horse racing stables, the people who work in and own them and threw them on them, or any kind of race stables, like maybe dog racing stables, but I'm guessing it's just horse stables. But in any case, seems kind of random, but there might be that kind of connection there. What about medically? So Jupiter represents the abdomen, the belly, because Jupiter is related to adipose tissue, and a lot of people, if they have a little extra goods on them, then sometimes their belly protrudes a little bit, that sort of thing. Also the lungs, probably because there's so much fluid there potentially. I'm not quite sure about lungs, but also maybe ether because of the exchange of air, oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange potentially. The brain, probably because the brain is mostly made of fat. The ears, I think that has to do with balance and equilibrium. But the other thing is that ears, sound in general, that sense of picking up sound is more of a Vata ether type of quality. So maybe that's why it's on the list. Homeostasis, I mentioned, equilibrium. Also things like pancreas, glycogen, diabetes, so things related to sugar breakdown, sugar metabolism. Liver issues, so jaundice, cholesterol, things related to the liver. Also swellings and tumors, so things that expand, and that probably, usually when things swell and expand quickly especially, it's usually because of fluid buildup. But you might also have to consider the moon, because the moon is also responsible for fluids, and maybe Mars. Well, Mars is more bone marrow rather than blood, so maybe not Mars, but maybe moon. And then also lymphatic and circulatory congestion, because again, there's swelling and expansion typically with that. And then things like problems with saliva, lacrimose glands, sweat glands. So again, when there's fluid isn't moving well and isn't evenly distributed, then Jupiter can be an issue, or part of the problem here, in somebody's chart. Issues of expansion, distribution generally, not just with fluids. Recklessness, so if we're talking about kind of mental things, recklessness, because again, that's sort of overconfidence and exaggeration, because Jupiter can create enthusiasm and optimism, maybe too much optimism. People aren't really considering things realistically, and it can be things like overexertion, like again, they're not really taking into account their true capacity. They're being too optimistic and overdoing things, and so they wear themselves out. That can be obesity, being overweight, because again, it typically involves adipose tissue and growth, expansion. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, we would say that Jupiter rules the Meta Dhatu, which is the adipose tissue. It can also involve things like sciatica and rheumatism, maybe rheumatism because of the fluid in the joints. I'm not sure why that's there, but maybe. Also difficulty with children and teachers, because Jupiter represents things like children and teachers. Fertility issues, so have the ability to have children. We typically, when we're looking or assessing, children and how many and children in somebody's horoscope, one of the things we look at is the quality of Jupiter and where it's placed, because if it's not well placed and if it's not very strong, there might be issues with fertility, although there are other issues that can affect fertility. That's not the only one. And also genetic or inherited diseases, whether they're physical or psychological, so things that are passed on through the generations. So places related to Jupiter, or that Jupiter can indicate: banks, vaults, treasury, so that gets back to the money, high-level financial institutions, stock, commodity markets, all money, money, money. Dignified places, again, that's a kind of high-minded, high society type aspect of Jupiter. Courts of law, political assemblies, again, that's getting into the law and justice aspect. Prestigious universities, so again, high-minded, but also education. High-class events, society balls, more of the same. Charitable institutions, so that gets into the generous nature, potentially spiritual or religious nature of Jupiter, if that's part of the motivation for being part of charities. Altars, monasteries, missions, so again, that's getting more into like the religious or spiritual aspects of Jupiter. Human habitats, because Jupiter represents animals, of animals, vegetables, and minerals, and within animals, humans specifically. And if there's a kind of building, Jupiter tends to represent a wooden type of building. So flowers, foods, trees, jasmine is represented by Jupiter. Fruit trees, so again, productive, juicy, ripe, edible, sweet typically. Most fruits are sweet. Orchards, so lots of trees. Fatty foods, so this gets into the sort of like adipose tissue type, very thick and unctuous quality of foods. Fatty foods, fried foods, but pure foods as well. So again, if we're talking about sattvic, religious, spiritually prepared foods, that would be a Jupiter type of quality. Butter, ghee, olive oil, cream, so again, that kind of oily stuff. Pumpkin and squash. Pumpkin and squash typically, because they're pretty big, So again, we're getting into kind of size and expansion, whereas like Mercury was like long, thin, what was it, long, thin vegetables. Jupiter's like round and big, the way Jupiter itself, the planet, is round and big. Roots and bulbs, those are typically thick, if not round, and large, and also stabilizing for plants. And then sweet things, so sweet berries, sweet fruits, sugar cane, dates, honey, because Jupiter represents the sweet flavor, sweet herbs, sweet wine, that sort of thing. And mint, which may seem odd, but mint is actually very vata inducing, so very wind provoking, and it's very ether like as an herb goes. And so this gets into, sometimes it seems like diametrically opposed, like Jupiter represents ether, but also kapha, and kapha is made up of earth and water. So that seems a little bit disparate, so you got to keep that in mind. So even things like mint and very ethereal things can actually be Jupiter because of that spiritual nature. Okay, so time, distance, direction, maturation. So things related to Jupiter tend to mature in about 16 years. If this Jupiter was a person, you would be thinking about a young adult of about 30 years. So on the young side, but not a child or adolescent. Duration of things related to Jupiter are like 57 to 68 years. So there's duration here. It's partly because Jupiter is one of the slower planets. Oh, sorry for the interruption. I thought I was going to sneeze, and then I paused the recording, and I didn't sneeze. I finally caught the pause button at the right time, but it didn't happen. It's kind of funny. But things related to Jupiter as far as duration. Jupiter is one of the slower moving planets. It takes about a year for Jupiter to go through a sign or constellation, Rashi. Things related to Jupiter tend to have a longer duration. The season related to Jupiter is Hemanta, and this corresponds with the 20th November to 19th of Jan. So end of the year, beginning of the solar year, anyway. As far as length, it's related to 9 yojnas, and a yojna is 48 miles, so we're talking, mid-length here, 36 to 72 miles, thereabouts. And the direction related to Jupiter is the northeast. So that's important if you're interested in Vastu Shastra, or it's kind of like Indian Feng Shui, or energy placements of buildings and things in your home and workspace and that sort of thing. So shapes, color, gemstones related to Jupiter. And again, whenever I talk about gemstones, I offer a little bit of info here, but I was always advised by my astrology teachers not to use gemstones because they can amplify the energies of planets, and if maybe you're not aware that there are negative effects of some of these planets, or then it can cause problems. So I was advised not to use gemstones, to use more like mantras and things like that as upayas or planetary remedies. But if you happen to know somebody who really knows all that, how to set gemstones and on what day and what mantras, there's like a whole process, deep process about creating the right gemstone and the right size and shape and on the right finger and all this sort of thing, if you're going to do rings. I don't have that information, but if you find somebody who does, make sure you do find somebody who does know that inside and out. But in any case, so shape related to Jupiter is the ellipse. The color associated with Jupiter is yellow. The metal most associated with gold, with Jupiter, is gold, although I do see tin sometimes. That doesn't make as much sense to me, but maybe. I'm not the one who made the list. I just learned them, right? So, and then gemstones, yellow topaz, yellow sapphire. Is an alternative that's lower cost of citrine. So Jupiter. And so there you go. Now you know a little bit more about Jupiter, what it represents. If you're looking at your own horoscope or horoscopes in general, I want to thank you for your time, as always. It's just nice to know that people are interested in this ancient art and science. I find it fascinating, so I'm happy to share it with others. Again, if you're interested in learning Jyotish, I have all my teaching videos in the concepts playlist. I also have another YouTube channel called Nature Source Care, which I talk about things like other Vedic arts like Ayurveda and yoga, as well as homeopathy and naturopathic medicine, if that's of interest. And then, as you can see, I do a lot of photography. And I have a photography gift shop online, which you can visit at fineartamerica.com if that's of interest to you, some photography. But otherwise, I wish you well, and until the next one, take care. Namaste.